she was a beautiful and brilliant millionaire suddenly falling into a coma after a mysterious accident. He was a young doctor who defied orders to save her, only to uncover a deadly secret. When she awakened, both were swept into a storm of conspiracy, betrayal, and vengeance from those closest to her. Can love save them from the darkness? Sometimes. Life doesn't scream. It whispers, through the quiet beat of a heart trying to find its way back. The white glow of fluorescent lights spilled over the ICU ward, cold as the very air within it. Machines hummed their monotonous rhythm, beep, 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 like a mournful symphony for those dangling between life and death. Room 207 was quiet, almost eerily still. In the midst of that sterile, colorless space, a woman lay motionless. Olivia Nwen, 32 years old, founder of a tech empire worth billions. Now she was just a name in a medical file, a frail body submerged in a 6-month coma. No one knew why she wouldn't wake. Beside her bed, Dr. Aiden Lee stood frozen, hands hanging limply at his sides, his gaze fixed on Olivia's face. He was used to the silence of this place, accustomed to the pale light, familiar with names reduced to mere codes. But for some reason, Olivia made him pause. There was something about her, her pallid skin, her long black hair spilling like ink across the white pillow, her lashes resting lightly as if guarding a secret, that stirred an inexplicable unease in him. He'd read her file dozens of times. A highway accident on a rainy night, a mangled car, no witnesses, no cameras, diagnosis, mild concussion, no severe internal injuries. Yet despite every medical indicator, she wouldn't wake. Aiden stepped closer, staring at the monitor, flickering with numbers so stable they felt uncanny. Heart rate, 58. Blood pressure, 112/70. Oxygen levels, perfect. Everything was normal, except she wouldn't open her eyes. He leaned down, his hand tightening slightly around the pen in his white coat pocket as if grasping at something fleeting. "She's been like this for 6 months. A young nurse's hesitant voice broke the silence behind him. "Some say she doesn't want to wake up." Aiden didn't turn around. "People don't choose to fall into a coma," he said, his voice low but firm. "But maybe someone chose to keep her there." The words slipped out, startling even himself. He hadn't meant to say that, but they erupted from somewhere deep in his chest, like a nameless instinct. A faint breeze slipped through the cracked window, stirring the curtains gently. Aiden reached out to adjust the thin blanket over. "Olivia!" His fingers brushed her icy skin, and in that moment, just for a fleeting second, he thought he felt something tremble. No, it was probably his imagination, but he'd seen many patients, and Olivia was unlike anyone else. She didn't seem like someone lost in a deep, endless sleep. She seemed like someone trapped. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving her. His own heartbeat slowed, as if syncing with the rhythm on the monitor. Beep, beep, beep. The sounds were steady, almost hauntingly so. "Wake up," he thought silently. "If you're still in there, give me a sign. Just a little one." But Olivia remained still as a porcelain statue, her colorless lips sealed shut. Only the numbers on the screen moved, and then a thought crept into Aiden's mind, sending a chill down his spine. What if this wasn't an accident? The light in the ICU room blurred through the foggy glass. It was raining. Droplets pounded against the roof, as if the entire city were silently weeping for something yet unnamed. Inside room 207, Dr. Aiden Lee stood motionless before Olivia's bed. His breath stretched out, then compressed into a tense stream as his eyes fixed on the bandages wrapped around her chest and shoulders. They were old, yellowed, long overdue for a change. "Why hasn't anyone noticed this?" Aiden growled, his chest tight with anger. She was a coma patient, but not a corpse. Her body was still alive, still feeling, still enduring. The faint red marks on her pale skin, visible whenever he gave her a cursory check, were silent proof of that. Just as he reached for the medical scissors, a familiar voice sliced through the air behind him, sharp as a blade. "Stop, Dr. Lee." Margaret, the head nurse of the ICU, entered the room like a cold gust of wind. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, a clipboard tucked under her elbow like an invisible weapon. "You're not allowed to change her bandages. There's a specific protocol. There are orders." Aiden turned, his eyes darkening. "And those orders say we should let her suffocate under her own gauze?" Margaret's lips tightened. "She's not an ordinary patient, Aiden. She's Olivia Nwen, a public figure. Every mistake gets magnified 100-fold. Her family hasn't even visited." Aiden cut in, his voice dropping abruptly. "No one's here but me." He bent down, carefully sliding the scissors beneath the fabric, now dry and stiff with time. The sharp snip of the scissors echoed in the quiet room, making Margaret nearly hold her breath. She moved to intervene but stopped, because in that moment Aiden wasn't just a doctor. He was the only one who saw Olivia as a person, not just a challenging medical case. The bandages came off, slowly, gently, as if he feared hurting the motionless figure before him. When the final piece of gauze was removed, Aiden froze. Deep, vivid red marks ran across her ribcage, silent accusations from a body neglected for far too long. He swallowed hard, not out of revulsion, but anger. A simmering rage spread through his chest, suffocating, as if he were the one being constricted. She hasn't been able to breathe properly for months. Aiden washed his hands, retrieved fresh bandages, and began rewrapping her, carefully, methodically. Not too tight, not too loose, just enough to hold and enough to cherish. As his hand brushed lightly against Olivia's skin, something strange happened. Beep. A sharp sound pierced the air from the monitor. Not an alarm, a change. Aiden whipped around, heart rate 60, then 62, 65, and climbing. Margaret's clipboard clattered to the floor. Her eyes widened, her lips parting soundlessly. "What's happening?" Aiden rushed to the monitor. No mistake. It wasn't a random fluctuation, it was a sign, the first biological response after 6 months of total stillness. He turned back, staring straight at Olivia. Her eyes remained closed, but her lips twitched, a movement so subtle it could have been mistaken for a breeze. "Olivia," he whispered, leaning slightly toward her, one hand grasping her icy wrist. Beep, beep, beep. Her heartbeat stronger, not erratic but deliberate, rhythmic, alive. In that moment time seemed to halt. The rain outside still poured, but in this room something had cracked open, as if the world inside Olivia had just tapped back. "If you're still in there, Olivia, you just answered me," Aiden thought, his eyes locked on her reviving heartbeat. Something bigger had begun, and he knew, from this moment on, he wouldn't step back. That night, the rain refused to stop. Streaks of water smeared the golden glow of streetlights against the break room walls, casting wavering shadows like nameless memories. Aiden slumped in the corner of the on-call room, clutching a long cold cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on Olivia's CT scan pinned in front of him. No severe brain damage, no hemorrhage, no skull fractures, nothing. An accident, no witnesses, no cameras. No one talks about it, and now, a clear biological response the moment he changed her bandages, helping her breathe more freely. Coincidence? Or had something been hidden from the start? A quiet unease slithered up Aiden's spine, making his shoulders twitch. He shot to his feet. A strange thought sparked in his mind, like a faint knock on his consciousness. If this wasn't a coma caused by the accident, then someone had kept her in this state. But why? He left the on-call room, striding down the dimly lit ICU corridor, silent as a labyrinth. His old sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished tiles. Room after room, patient after patient, injury after injury. But only one person kept him awake. not because of her condition, but because of what remained unsaid. The door to the supplies room creaked as he pushed it open. The sharp smell of antiseptic hit him, thick and suffocating. He flicked on his phone's flashlight, running his hand along the shelves of commonly used drugs. Morphine, saline, adrenaline, midazolam, all labeled, neatly sealed, until the beam of light stopped on an empty patch behind a box of medical gauze. Something glinted faintly behind a stack of bandages, a small, unmarked glass vial, transparent, filled with a pale liquid that looked like water. Aiden froze. His heart pounded, threatening to leap from his chest. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. No barcode, no production date, no pharmaceutical logo. An anonymous vial in a place where everything was tracked down to the milligram. "What the hell is this?" Aiden whispered, his voice hoarse. He held the vial up to the light. Under the flashlight's beam, the liquid inside remained crystal clear, as if it were nothing but it sent ripples of dread through him. This wasn't a standard drug, and it certainly wasn't something that belonged in the hospital's pharmacy. He slipped the vial into the inner pocket of his blouse, cautious as if hiding a living piece of evidence. Then he quietly shut the door and returned to the on-call room. His eyes scanned the night shift roster. No one was around. Good. The perfect chance to act undetected. His fingers scrolled through his contacts. A name popped up, Jake Rivera, an old med school friend, now a lab technician. "Aiden? It's 2 a.m. Jake's sleepy voice crackled through the phone. "I need you. Urgent. Off the record." "What now, another coma patient thing?" "I'm not kidding, Jake. I need a sample analyzed. No logs. Can you do it?" A brief silence, then a sigh. "Meet me at the cafe across from the hospital, 7 a.m. tomorrow. Bring your mystery vial." Aiden hung up, leaning against the wall as a nameless wave surged within him. He didn't have solid proof yet, but a powerful gut feeling told him someone didn't want Olivia to wake up, and they'd been so close, too close for anyone to suspect a thing. He glanced down at the pocket where the small vial rested silently. It looked harmless, but he knew the most harmless-looking things were often the ones that could poison a person, not just physically, but in their very existence. If someone's drowning you, Aiden thought, his gaze drifting toward the darkened ICU wing, "I'll be the one to pull you up." And in the thick darkness outside, the rain kept falling, as if someone were washing away the traces of a crime yet unnamed. The sky hadn't yet brightened. Manhattan was still drenched in misty rain as Aiden hurried into the rundown cafe across from the hospital. The smell of burnt coffee mingled with the sluggish hum of the espresso machine, grounding him in the present, but his mind lingered in the ICU, on Olivia's sudden heartbeat, on the unmarked glass vial tucked in his pocket. Jake Rivera was already there, hair disheveled, an untouched espresso in front of him. His sleepy eyes widened slightly more than usual when Aiden set the vial on the table. "Jesus," Jake muttered, lifting it with 2 fingers as if it might explode. "No label, no seal. Who gave you this?" Aiden gripped the handle of his coffee mug tightly, his voice dropping low. "I found it myself, in the hospital storage, behind some old gauze." Jake frowned. "You know this could be anything, right? Eye drops, disinfectant, or some toxin the FDA hasn't even approved. Or the thing that's kept my patient in a coma for the past 6 months, Aiden interrupted, his gaze unwavering. Silence fell between them. The rain tapped lightly against the window. After a moment, Jake nodded, as if surrendering to the weight of Aiden's conviction laid bare on the table. "Fine, I'll run the sample. No records, no names, but if this ties into politics or money, I don't want to get dragged in. I'll protect you," Aiden said instantly, his eyes sparking with a fire Jake had only seen a few times. When Aiden called out a professor for taking bribes, when he took a hit for a patient attacked by their family, when he lost a scholarship but kept his integrity. 2 days later, a text from Jake, just 4 words, "Meet me, got results." This time it was a small park behind the hospital. Fewer prying eyes, quiet enough for the truth to be spoken without being smothered by the noise of power. Jake handed over an envelope containing a plain printed report. No header, no codes. Midazolam, low dose, Jake said softly. A benzodiazepine. Suppresses the nervous system, relaxes muscles, dulls awareness. But at this dose, he paused, emphasizing each word. It's enough to keep someone almost awake but not truly conscious. It won't kill, but it won't let them wake up either. Aiden felt as if someone had just poured ice water down his neck. This, he murmured, was designed to keep someone awake in the dark. Jake nodded, pulling an unlit cigarette from his pocket and twirling it between his fingers like a sentry spinning a rifle. Not common in hospitals, but the elite. You know them. Keeping someone compliant without physical harm is an art. Aiden stared at the black ink on the page, neat and merciless like a death sentence. Olivia hadn't been sleeping, she'd been dragged down, held in a murky haze like diluted ink, and now every feeling in him, anger, pity, fear, resolve, mixed together, lodging in his throat. I don't think this is random anymore, Aiden said, his voice breaking free from a stone wall. Someone wanted her trapped, not awake, not dead, just enough to stay silent. Jake sighed. And if you keep going, you'll be the next target. Aiden didn't reply. He simply folded the paper, slipping it carefully into his blouse's inner pocket. No words were needed. The look in his eyes said it all. I've made my choice. Back at the hospital, the rain still fell. But to Aiden, the drops were no longer a lament, they were a warning bell. He strode through the empty corridor, the white lights reflecting his slanted figure like a warrior returning from the front lines. He knew this wasn't enough. Pieces were still missing. Who put the vial there? Who gave the order? Who was behind it? But at least, now he had a lead, a small one, but the first pulse of truth. They can hide everything, but they can't hide the truth forever. He thought silently, opening the ICU door and looking at Olivia, still lying there like an unanswered question. You're not alone anymore. A week after receiving the test results, Aiden stood alone in the security room in the basement of St. Augustine's Hospital. Cold light flickered from rows of monitors flashing green and red, capturing every corner of the hallways, every cart, every shadow passing through the night. Sweat beaded lightly on his temples, not from fear, but from a gut feeling whispering what he needed was buried in these blurry video feeds. The on-duty guard, an older man with silver hair named Don, was the only person Aiden trusted right now. Don had no love for the elite and a soft spot for weird stuff. I'll give you 3 hours, Don grumbled, pressing a ring of keys into Aiden's hand. If anyone asks, I know nothing. Still the coolest, Don, Aiden said with a tense smile. Thanks. He sat down at the control panel. The main screen displayed November 5th, 3 days after Olivia was admitted. She was already in a coma by then, and if they existed, had started acting, this was the moment. Aiden fast-forward. The ICU hallway. Empty. The pharmacy. Nurses coming and going as usual, nothing out of the ordinary. Until 2:17 a.m. He paused. His finger instinctively slowed on the controls. A figure appeared in the corner of the frame. Tall, lean, gray suit. Unmistakable. Daniel Nwen. Olivia's only brother. The one who'd been running her conglomerate for the past 6 months. The one who smiled for the press cameras, saying, "My sister needs time, I respect that. But he shouldn't be here. Sneaking around in the dead of night, alone, no entourage." The footage rolled on. Daniel stopped to speak with a nurse, short, petite, hair tied back neatly, Jenny. She was on duty that night, almost invisible in the reports. Aiden held his breath. Daniel pulled a small, clear vial from his pocket, identical to the one Aiden had found. He handed it to Jenny. She glanced around, nervous. Daniel touched her shoulder lightly, a gesture that could have been a promise or a warning. My God. Aiden leaned back from the screen. his entire body going cold. No more doubts. This was proof. Not just speculation or chemical analysis. Action, motive, evidence, witness, all captured in that grainy, distorted clip. Daniel wasn't just running the company for Olivia, he was actively removing her from the game. 1 hour later, the nurse's break room was deserted. The clock read 3:12 a.m. Aiden stood by the coffee machine, pretending to fumble with it. In the mirror, he caught the reflection of a small figure sitting quietly in the corner. Jenny. He turned, walking slowly toward her. She flinched when she saw him. "Dr. Lee, this late? Do you need something?" Aiden didn't answer right away. He set his coffee cup on the table, then pulled a still from the video out of his pocket. Daniel handing over the vial, his hand on her shoulder, Jenny's face in the image, etched with fear. Jenny stared at the photo. Her entire body seemed to freeze. "I don't want to hurt you," Aiden said, soft but clear. "I just need the truth." She pressed her lips together, her eyes reddening. The coffee in her hand trembled. A drop spilled over the edge, staining her blouse. "He said it was just a supportive drug," she whispered, "to help her rest. He said she'd wake up soon." "How much did he give you?" Aiden asked, not coldly, but with sorrow. Jenny's voice broke. 5,000, and a promise that I'd get transferred. No more night shifts, no more blood, no more screams. A heavy silence smothered the room. Wind whistled through the cracked window, scattering a few shift schedules across the floor. "I didn't know it'd last this long," she sobbed. "I thought a few days, a week, then she'd wake up, but it just kept going. And I stayed quiet too long." Aiden pulled out a recorder, pressing it with a soft click. Jenny looked at him, then nodded. Her voice shook but held firm. "My name is Jenny Harper. I'm a nurse at St. Augustine's ICU. I received an unlabeled vial from Daniel Nwen, Olivia Nwen's brother. On the night of November 5th, I administered it as requested, thinking it was to help her. But now I believe I was used to poison Olivia." Aiden turned off the recorder. His heart pounded like a drum. Not from fear, but because at last he had the truth and a living witness. There was no turning back. The game had begun, and the one who'd held the upper hand was about to be exposed. "Sorry, Olivia," he thought silently, gazing down the hall toward the faint light spilling from the ICU like a fragile hope. "This time, you're not fighting alone." The medical boardroom on the 8th floor of St. Augustine's Hospital was typically a place for dull discussions about budgets, staffing plans, and PR strategies. But this morning, the air in that room was thick, as if someone had cracked open a door to hell. Aiden stepped in, clutching a thick file bound with red twine. Inside were stills from the security footage, the recording of Nurse Jenny's confession, the lab report on the vial, and, above all, an unshakable resolve. Around the long walnut table sat doctors, executives, and legal reps, their faces stern. No one anticipated what was about to unfold. At the head of the table, Daniel Nwen sat calmly, dressed in a black suit with a red tie, idly turning a Japanese ceramic coffee cup as if this were just another press conference. His gaze swept over Aiden, half surprise, half mockery. "Dr. Lee," Daniel spoke first, his voice smooth as silk. "I didn't realize I was important enough to warrant a personal invitation from you." Aiden didn't smile. He stood tall, his eyes hard as steel. "This isn't an invitation, Daniel. It's a confrontation." A sharp clatter rang out as Aiden opened the file, pulling out a printed image from the security camera. Daniel in the hospital hallway at 2 a.m., handing an unlabeled vial to Jenny. The room went silent. "This is footage from the night of November 5th, 3 days after your sister, Olivia Nwen, was admitted in a coma. This is you, and this is the vial you gave to the nurse on duty." Aiden slid a recorder forward next. Jenny's voice filled the air, trembling but clear. "Daniel said it was a drug to help her relax. I believed him. I administered it, but now I know. I was wrong." Daniel chuckled softly, a smug laugh, as if the room were his personal stage. Well, quite the performance, Dr. Lee. Ever thought of a career in film? Aiden didn't blink. Don't deflect. Daniel rose slowly. His tie swayed faintly with each step. A nurse changing her story after 6 months? A blurry clip? An unlabeled vial? And you, a low-tier doctor with nothing to your name but a few patient thank yous. You think you can accuse me with that? His voice dropped, snapping. Shut like a trap. You're out of your league, Aiden. I represent Olivia's conglomerate, which funds this hospital. I pay for half the ICU wing you work in. Without me, your poor patients wouldn't even have beds. His words sliced across the table, sharp and icy. But Aiden didn't back down. Instead, he stepped forward. His voice was steady, each word forged in molten steel. You're right, Daniel. I don't have power. I don't have money. But I have the truth, and I have the guts to speak it when no one else dares. Aiden pulled out the chemical analysis from the lab. Proof the vial contained a low-dose sedative, not part of the hospital's treatment protocols. This isn't on the formulary. No one prescribed it. But it's in Olivia's blood, and the sample I found matches the vial you handed over perfectly. The room was deathly still. A few exchanged glances. Someone leaned forward to scrutinize the photo. Daniel's grip tightened, his faint smile crumbling like ash. You think this little cat-and-mouse game will take me down? Aiden met his gaze. His eyes were no longer those of a doctor, but of someone who'd seen the abyss and still walked to its edge. I'm not playing games. I'm protecting a woman buried alive by her own brother. Daniel stepped closer, growling. She's my flesh and blood. It's a family matter. She's a person, Aiden shot back. Not property, not a tool to expand your influence. No one spoke, but a lawyer's phone began tapping. An elderly doctor cleared his throat. Someone nodded faintly. Aiden's gaze swept the room, not expecting support but seeing something more vital. They were listening. Daniel glanced around, sensing the shift in the board's dynamic. He took a breath, then turned. I have a meeting. If you want to keep up this circus, send an official summons from the board. Otherwise... Sorry, I don't have the time. He started to leave, but Aiden's voice rang out, firm as a command. I've already sent copies of this file to Olivia's family lawyers, and if you take one more wrong step, I'll send it straight to the state court. Daniel froze for exactly 1 second. Then he strode out. The door clicked shut, a faint warning. The room buzzed softly. Whispers. Scribbling. Young nurse turned to Aiden, her eyes wide with awe. You just took on Daniel Nguyen. Aiden nodded. Not the last time. He turned away, still clutching the file. Through the frosted glass, the ICU's light flickered like a fragile beacon in a storm. You woke up once because of a small act, he thought, his hand tightening around the file. This time, I'll wake the world to protect you. Night settled gently over the city, like a heavy blanket muffling every sound, then faded into mist and the distant hum of car horns. But inside ICU room 207, the night wasn't quite a respite. Aiden sat there, as he did every night, beside Olivia Nwen's bed. The creaky wooden chair bore the imprint of his frame after countless sleepless nights. His eyes were sunken from exhaustion, yet they still held the same tenderness as the first time he'd touched her bandages. Olivia lay still, a living statue, her black hair spilled softly across the pillow. A breathing tube threaded through her nose, her breaths steady but thin as mist. Aiden gently clasped her wrist, his fingers brushing against skin that was cold but not lifeless. On the contrary, there was something simmering, like embers glowing beneath ashes. I faced Daniel today, Aiden said softly, his voice hoarse but warm. I know who's been keeping you in this darkness, and I won't let him do anything more. Outside, the rain began pattering again. Rain, always falling whenever he was with her. He squeezed Olivia's hand lightly, not to wake her but to remind her he was there. And then, A movement so small it might not have been real, her eyelids trembled. Just for a fleeting moment, Aiden held his breath. He didn't move. His eyes locked onto her face, afraid that if he blinked, the moment would dissolve. Then, again, her lashes fluttered, and then opened, slowly, so slowly. Those eyes, ones he'd only known from her file photos, now stared straight at him. They were clouded by the light, dazed but unmistakably aware, alive, human. Aiden's breath hitched, his grip tightening on her hand like a lifeline reflex. "Olivia," he whispered, as if calling to a dream that hadn't yet slipped away. She couldn't speak. The breathing tube silenced any sound in her throat, but her eyes widened, torn between fear, confusion, and something akin to hope. Aiden immediately grabbed a pen light to check her pupils. They constricted, full reflex. He let out a silent sob, his shoulders trembling faintly like a child witnessing a miracle for the first time. "Can you hear me?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "If you can, blink once." A brief hesitation, then a one. Aiden's heart pounded like a war drum. He lifted her hand closer to his chest, holding it firmly, as if afraid to lose the fragile connection just beginning to bloom. Olivia's eyes followed his every move, slowly, weakly, but never wavering. "You're back," he whispered. "And I've been here the whole time." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. She couldn't speak, but she was crying, because she heard, because she understood, because she was alive. Aiden didn't know when he'd started crying too. But he didn't care. He leaned down, his forehead brushing lightly against hers, their breaths mingling between two weary halves of a soul. "No one's touching you again," he said softly. "Not Daniel, not the world, not any fear." In his hand, her fingers moved, barely, squeezing his. A faint squeeze, but enough to send Aiden's heart plummeting freely from his chest. She was awake, and she remembered. The room was no longer just an ICU, no longer a way station between life and death. It was a place of beginning again, for a woman who'd been buried alive, and a man who refused to let her be forgotten. "I see you," Aiden thought. Amid all that darkness, "I finally see you." The first morning Olivia was brought out of the ICU, the sky was full of sunlight. Sunlight slipped through the hospital windows, stretching across the floor like golden silk ribbons, gently brushing the wheels of her chair and her dark hair, now less tangled. Olivia sat there, fragile as a fledgling bird just freed from a cocoon of darkness. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her eyes spoke for her, of gratitude, fear, and something new. Aiden pushed the wheelchair slowly down the quiet hallway of the rehabilitation wing. He wasn't wearing a white coat today. Today, he was just a man in a gray hoodie, hands gripping the handles behind the chair, as if guiding the woman he loved on a stroll through a park. "What do you see?" he asked softly. Olivia looked through the window. A young maple tree was budding by the flower bed. Sparrows hopped along the railing. "For the first time in 6 months, everything doesn't feel like a dream," she whispered. Aiden gave a small laugh. "And I'm here to pinch you whenever you need a reminder you're awake." She glanced at him. "Just don't use a needle." He laughed. A real laugh, the first after so many cold nights, and for a strange moment all the exhaustion retreated. The physical therapy room was silent. They stood before the parallel bars, 2 long iron rods stretching from wall to wall, cold and proud, as if challenging legs that had just begun to breathe again. Olivia stared at them, then at her own legs, thin, pale, the muscles still feeling foreign to her. "They don't remember me anymore," she murmured. Aiden knelt down, gently placing a hand on her shin, his gaze serious yet warm. "They do. They just need you to forgive them." A brief silence. Then Olivia took a deep breath, gripped the bars, and with all her strength, stood. She trembled, Her legs wobbled like reeds in the wind. Each step was a battle between willpower and fear. But every time she wanted to give up, Aiden's voice rose. Not loud, not forceful, but gentle, like a whisper in a dream. One more step. Good job, you can do it. Just like that. Sweat soaked her forehead, her lips pressed tight, her face contorted in pain, but she didn't stop, not when Aiden was right beside her, his hands always ready to catch her if she fell. "What if I fall?" she asked faintly during a pause. "Then I'll catch you, and catch you again and again, until you don't need me to anymore," he replied without hesitation. Olivia lowered her head. A tear fell, but it wasn't from weakness. It was from a budding trust. In the afternoons that followed, they sat on the rehab center's balcony, a place where Manhattan shimmered in the distance like an old dream. Aiden read to her, sometimes medical journals, sometimes novels, sometimes silly things like 100 Ways to Grow a Cactus Without Getting Pricked. She laughed. He looked at her smile like someone seeing the first light after a storm. No rush, no possession, just quietly accepting it as an unexpected gift. One night she woke drenched in sweat from a nightmare. Aiden came immediately, bringing a warm towel and a wooden chair. "It's okay, just a dream," he soothed, wiping her forehead with gentle fingers. "Worse than a dream," she whispered, "is waking up and feeling like no one's there." He said nothing. He just took her hand and placed it on his chest. "Now you don't have to wake up alone anymore." The day Olivia walked 10 steps without support, the therapy room erupted in applause. She sat, panting, her lips parting in a smile both tired and proud. Aiden sat beside her, handing her a water bottle, his eyes shining as if he'd just won the greatest medical prize of his life. "You're amazing, Olivia," he said, unable to hide his emotion. "It's because of you," she replied, lightly touching his hand. "No one believed I'd wake up, but you did." Even before I did, they looked at each other. Amid the oxygen tubes, machines, practice floors, and sunlight, something undefined had taken root. Not a fleeting touch, but a shared lifeline, an answer to a question never spoken aloud. "You're the reason I wanted to live again," she thought to herself, but didn't dare say. "You're the only thing I can't bear to lose," he thought to himself, and knew. It was too late to turn back. 3 weeks later, it was an early autumn morning, the New York air crisp as a whisper. Sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the stone steps of the Manhattan District Courthouse. Amid the bustling crowd ascending the stairs, a slender figure emerged. Olivia Nwen, leaning lightly on a wooden cane, her shoulders draped in a gray blazer, her face thinner, but her eyes ablaze. She walked slowly but with pride, as if each step declared to the world, "I am no longer silent. I am alive, and I've come to reclaim my name." Beside her, Aiden Lee walked quietly. His suit couldn't hide the tension in his eyes, but his hand remained steady behind Olivia's back, ready to catch her if she stumbled, though both knew today she wouldn't fall again. Courtroom number 6 was packed. Reporters, lawyers, nurses she'd once worked with, corporate shareholders, all were present. The media swarmed from the hallway to the glass doors. Camera flashes popped silently like fireworks. Daniel Nwen sat at the defendant's table, still in a perfectly tailored suit, tied knotted tight, his face as icy as ever, except today he wasn't smiling. Across from him sat Olivia, her eyes locked on her younger brother, the boy who once held her hand as a child, only to grow into the man who poisoned her with betrayal. Her lawyer, Rachel Kim, a sharp woman with a voice like a blade, opened the trial with a clear accusation. "Today, we're not just addressing a criminal act, we're exposing a deliberate conspiracy to destroy a person's life and reputation, all to seize control of the billion-dollar corporation she founded." Her words thundered through the silent room. Rachel presented evidence, a photo from a security camera showing Daniel handing an unlabeled vial to Nurse Jenny, then a lab analysis confirming the sedative was potent enough to sustain long-term unconsciousness. Finally, a recording. Jenny's choked voice. I administered it because I trusted him, but now I know I was used. Daniel smirked, whispering something to his lawyer, but his eyes flicked toward Olivia as if hoping she'd look away. She didn't. She stared back, unshaken, unyielding. Then her name was called. Ms. Olivia Nwen, please take the stand. Aiden squeezed her hand under the table. She didn't look at him. She only gently pulled away, as if to say, I can walk on my own now. Every eye followed as Olivia stood. She approached the witness stand, each slow step echoing in the hushed room. The tap of her cane marked time, like a metronome counting the months she'd been trapped within her own body. Once steady, she lifted her head and faced the jury directly. I once thought I'd never wake up, she began, her voice low but clear. But the worst part wasn't the coma. It was knowing the person who put me there was the one I trusted most. She spoke of Daniel, his devoted care, his sweet words belied by cold eyes. She described being trapped in her body, hearing everything but unable to resist. She recounted the vague terror of consciousness drifting between wakefulness and oblivion, like someone buried alive. I know I was nearly erased from this world, and I know I'm not the only one hurt by greed and cruelty disguised as family. She paused, looked at Daniel. But today I stand here, not for revenge, but to put an end to it. No one spoke, yet the room seemed to converge on her, slender but unbroken, soft but not weak. The verdict came late that afternoon. The court finds the defendant Daniel Nwen guilty of premeditated poisoning and abuse of guardianship. Recommended sentence, 12 years imprisonment with no parole for the first 3 years. The metallic clink of handcuffs locking around Daniel's wrists rang cold. For the first time, he turned his face away, no longer proud enough to meet his sister's gaze. Outside the courthouse, Olivia sat on the steps, exhaling deeply. Aiden brought a shawl and draped it gently over her shoulders. I thought you'd cry, he said softly. I thought I would too, she replied, her eyes tracing the sky. But now I just feel light. A breeze swept by, lifting strands of her hair. Aiden tucked them back, his hand lingering near her cheek, longer than usual. She didn't pull away. She just looked at him, their gazes meeting like two flames burning together in the night. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For not letting go, even when I wasn't sure I was worth holding on to. He smiled, lowering his head. You don't need to be worthy of anyone. You just need to live. That's enough, and I chose to live, she thought, not for revenge, but to begin again. Late afternoon sunlight cast a warm golden glow over the courthouse steps. Olivia and Aiden had just emerged from the heavy wooden doors when the clamor hit. Camera clicks, shouted names, and reporters surging like a storm. The press, waiting since early morning, now pounced, engulfing the pair who had just triumphed in a earth-shaking Olivia tightened her grip on Aiden's hand. He gave a slight nod. Together, they pressed through the crowd, each step steady, as if they'd rehearsed for this moment their entire lives. A question shot out from the press line. Olivia, will you resume leading the corporation or hand over control? She only smiled, but before she could answer, Aiden froze. A chill ran down his spine. He saw something. A tall figure in a black hoodie at the far end of the steps, moving. Too fast, too low, too direct. Aiden stepped in front of Olivia. Down, he shouted. The yell rang out and chaos erupted. An arm rose, metal glinted, a knife. Before Olivia could process what was happening, Aiden lunged between her and the attacker, his body twisting halfway to shield her completely. Thud! The blade plunged deep into his left shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh. He roared in pain but clamped down on the assailant's wrist, shoving him backward until he tumbled down the steps. Blood began soaking his shirt, bright red like the wail of an ambulance siren rising from a distant street corner. Olivia screamed. Aiden! Aiden! She rushed to him, dropping to her knees as security personnel wrestled the stranger to the ground. A burly man with a scarred face, silent as stone. From his side, a bag of cash spilled out. Crisp $100 bills, bound with rubber bands. "Hired hit," one of the guards muttered. "Obvious." In Olivia's arms, Aiden tilted his head to look at her, his face pale from blood loss. "I'm fine," he managed, though blood welled in his mouth. "Shut up," she sobbed, trembling as she pressed her scarf against the wound. "Don't talk like that. You can't leave me," he chuckled weakly, blood staining the corner of his lips. "First time seeing you give orders so fierce." He pressed her forehead to his, tears falling onto his cheeks. "I just beat Daniel, Aiden. I just took my life back. You can't leave, not now." His trembling hand rose, brushing the tears from her face. "I'm not going anywhere. Haven't even kissed you yet." Olivia laughed through her tears, then turned to the medics rushing toward them. "Stretcher, now. Emergency room." 3 hours later, in the recovery room, Aiden lay still on a white bed. Olivia sat beside him, her hand never leaving his, her eyes never blinking. The door swung open. A police officer stepped in, nodding to her. "We've got him." The guy was hired by Daniel Nwen, an anonymous account funneled through overseas banks. But there's enough evidence. Olivia closed her eyes. No tears, no trembling. She said only one thing: "I'll never let him near anyone I love again." 1 week later, Aiden opened his eyes. The first light he saw was Olivia's face, haggard but more beautiful than ever. She was holding his hand, her head resting on his bandaged arm. He whispered, "You haven't run off yet?" She lifted her head, looking at him, then smiled, though her eyes were red-rimmed. "You took a knife for me. The least I can do is wait until you're healed before dumping you." He laughed. It hurt, but it was real. "This time, it's not me waking up in your arms," she thought. "It's you surviving. In mine." New York, morning. The city buzzed as usual, but in a television studio on the 23rd floor of a glass building, the air was thick with tension. Backstage, Olivia stood still in the preparation room, the overhead lights reflecting off her pale skin, worn from a long battle. She wore a simple black dress, no diamonds, no logos, no billionaire flair. Just a woman who'd once had her voice stolen and was now about to reclaim it. On the vanity table before her sat a small photo. Aiden, in his hospital bed, flashing a thumbs up at the camera, grinning wide despite the bandages still wrapped around his shoulder. Olivia brushed the edge of the photo lightly. She took a deep breath. "Mrs. Olivia, 5 minutes," her assistant called. "I'm ready. Live, 8 a.m. The program Woman of the Year opened with a soothing piano melody, the LED screen behind gradually displaying her name. Olivia Nwen, alongside the words, "Survivor," "Leader," "Lover." The host, a well-known female presenter, turned to Olivia, seated across from her. "Olivia, the world has followed your journey, from the accident, the shocking trial, to your incredible comeback. But today, I don't want to ask about the corporation or Daniel. I want to ask about love." The audience fell silent. A wave of anticipation rippled through the crew, the director, the viewers. The host smiled encouragingly. "Tell us about Dr. Aiden Lee, the man who stepped out from the shadows and now holds the center of your heart." Olivia looked into the camera. In that moment, the world stopped. "I once thought I'd never love again," she began, her voice steady, though cracks of emotion hid beneath each word. "I was betrayed, manipulated, left trapped in my own body. For 6 months, I lived unable to speak, move, or cry for help. And then..." She paused, her gaze fixed on the lens, as if looking straight at Aiden, watching her from his hospital room TV. "He came into my life, not with promises, but with actions. Changing bandages, holding my hand, sitting by my side every night when no one asked him to. Her voice caught, but her eyes blazed. He believed I was still alive when the world thought I was just a name on a ventilator. He risked himself to pull me from the darkness, and risked it again when a real knife came for me. The audience held their breath. The camera zoomed in slowly on her face, now radiant with confidence, control, and love. And I love him, not because he's a doctor, not because he saved me, but because he saw me when I couldn't even see myself. He was the first person not to call me a millionaire, a target, or a burden. He just called me Olivia. She lowered her head, a faint smile breaking through, like dawn after a long morning. If the world wants to call us a mismatched couple, go ahead. If they want to write thousands of articles guessing how much I'm paying him, let them. She lifted her head, her voice now forged like steel from tears. I'm here not to justify anything. I'm here to acknowledge it. I love Aiden Lee in front of the entire world, and I won't apologize for that. The room erupted. A thunderous applause broke out, not just for the power of her words, but for her courage. Backstage, her assistant burst into tears. Out there, headlines flooded social media. Olivia Nwen, survivor, speaks out for love. She's not just a billionaire, she's a woman who dares to love. In his hospital room, Aiden sat up in bed, eyes glued to the TV. He went still. Then, slowly, he laughed. Damn it, she really did it. The nurse beside him laughed too, her eyes misty. You're the luckiest guy in this hospital. Aiden glanced at the window, where sunlight slipped through the blinds. No, I'm the luckiest guy in this whole city, amid everything I've lost, Olivia thought after the broadcast. I've finally reclaimed the one thing worth keeping, the person who never let go. 1 year later, spring returned to New York with blooming trees in Central Park and the cheerful chirping of birds filtering through the wide-open windows of a small red brick house on a quiet street corner in Queens. A new wooden sign stood out front. The new Aiden Lee Clinic. No insurance needed, just hope. Inside, sunlight flooded the patient waiting room where a long wooden table was piled with papers, boxes of bandages, medical files, and 2 cold cups of coffee. Aiden emerged from the exam room, his white coat draped loosely over his shoulders, holding the chart of an elderly patient who'd just left. A faint but happy smile played on his lips. At the reception desk, Olivia bent over her notes, her hair tied up neatly, fingers flying across the keyboard. She wore a white shirt and simple jeans. No one would guess she'd once helmed a global financial empire. But she didn't need that anymore. No more glass boardrooms, billion-dollar figures, or cold thrones of power. All she needed was this small room, the laughter of poor patients, and the man who stood by her every day. That afternoon they closed early. Aiden flipped the closed sign on the glass door and turned to find Olivia standing on the back porch, where a trellis of bougainvillea was bursting into bloom. "You know," she said as he approached, "I used to think a wedding had to be in a place like Venice or Paris. But now," she turned to him, smiling, "I realize it just needs to be here, with you, on this little porch, with the familiar smell of antiseptic." "That's enough." Aiden leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We'll get married in the park behind the house. The kids you saved will be bridesmaids. And instead of a wedding cake, we'll have pizza." She laughed. "I'm not surprised." The wedding took place a week later beneath an arch of maple trees just starting to turn color in the small park near the clinic. No extravagant gown, just Olivia in a plain white dress, her hair loosely braided, holding a bouquet of wildflowers picked by the child patients. Aiden wore a rolled-up shirt, a loose tie, and a grin like he'd just discovered magic. Only about 20 people attended. A few middle-aged patients, some boys who'd once had pneumonia, Nurse Jenny, now the clinic's coordinator, and a stray cat named Miso, a regular who came by every evening to steal scraps. No microphones, no cameras. Just quiet vows, clasped hands, and teary eyes as Olivia whispered, "No world is safe enough. But I choose to believe that with you, I don't need to run anymore." Aiden answered with a simple, heartfelt line that sank straight into the soul. "No matter what world collapses, I'll still choose to follow you. Every day." After the wedding, they didn't go on a honeymoon because the next day, a young mother banged on the clinic door in a panic. Her child had a high fever. Olivia shed her veil, slipped back into her shirt, and opened the door with her first words. "What's the little one's name? Any medical history?" Aiden stood behind her, handing her a mask then, sighed with quiet pride. "Honeymoon officially postponed, but you're stunning as a doctor." That evening, after the last patient left, they sat on the clinic's front steps, watching the sunset cast shadows over the warm brick row houses. Olivia rested her head on Aiden's shoulder. The sun gilded her hair, its light tracing the curve of peace. "We're not as rich as before," she whispered. "Not famous, no stocks or power." Aiden looked at her, his eyes soft as a breeze on her cheek. "But we have everything else. Time, hands, hearts, and each other." A boy passing by, clutching a prescription, waved. Olivia smiled and waved back. Aiden squeezed her hand gently. His heartbeat was steady, no longer driven by adrenaline, but by serenity. "I survived, I loved, and now I'm living. Not for fame, not for money, but for this sunset, and the person beside me,